Hi, everybody. I'm here today with Maia Poet, who we met on Twitter. And Maya, I'm very excited to speak with you today. You are a desister, so you are someone who formerly identified as transgender. You're a woman, you're female, and you identified as a boy or a man. So we're going to have a conversation today about what that looked like for you, kind of your journey, your experience, how you ended up to where you are today, and you also have some interesting you have other interesting elements that we're going to talk about, such as the fact that you lived for several years in Israel. So, and during the time that you were identifying as a man. So you have quite an interesting story. Let's go ahead and get into it. Start by just telling us, if you would, just about who you are today. So how do you identify today? How do you describe yourself? Where are you at in your life right now?
Yeah, so hi everybody. My name is Maya and I'm 24 years old. Right now, I've come to accept the fact that I am a woman. I desisted fairly recently within the last year. Living through war played a really large role in that process of desistance, which I'm sure we'll get into as this interview continues. And I'm a lesbian. I'm also a writer, researcher, public speaker. I love speaking languages. I love learning languages. And I guess I'm doing this interview because I see a lot of parallels between not only the ways in which like gender ideology has hijacked Western institutions one by one, but the ways in which this sort of like meaning crisis that's afflicting the West is causing other like Western institutions to accept other illiberal and dangerous ideologies in regards to Middle East politics, for example. I see a lot of parallels, and I'm kind of here to warn especially our Western audience about a variety of different things that I can kind of foresee happening.
Mm. Okay, so you told me just before we started recording that you moved back to the United States after October 7th. So what was that like for you? What was October 7th like for you? Where in Israel were you at the time?
So I'll actually back up to a few days before
Mm-hmm.
October 7th. So I was actually supposed to be at the Nova Music Festival that was invaded by Hamas, where they, butchered people and took hostages and all kinds of other horrific things. I was supposed to be there, but actually, so I was involved in a lot of peace activism and peace activities with Jews and Arabs. So I have a really eclectic friend group of Middle Easterners who are all really bad planners. Um, Jews and Arabs are pretty chaotic groups of people. So we were like trying to plan, how we were going to get to this festival because it was pretty far away from us. And basically we were a group of us, a big group of us, were going to go and like in different cars, basically. And really the reason that I didn't end up at that festival is because a few days before, our sober driver actually was like, nah, this weird flakiness in the friend group, like this lack of planning, I can't count on anybody. Like, I'm not going to do this. So our sober driver dropped out. And that's the reason why I didn't end up at that festival. And that's what saved my life. An inconvenience, like your driver dropping out, your friend who's going to be the driver, that's what saved my life. But because that happened, I decided to last minute, instead on October 6th, go to a peace event in a Bedouin village with Jewish and Arab children. And it was a really optimistic place to be because you show up in a village and you really feel the atmosphere of the village. And there were the kids of the village as well as our kids that we brought. And it was so optimistic because the kids were playing together and they didn't know each other's languages. But by the end of the meeting, the kids had picked up a few words of Arabic or Hebrew or English or Russian or French, whatever they were speaking. The kids, at that age, they're just sponges, And it was so optimistic. Like if a kid fell down, it was the nearest adult to them who helped them up and who helped comfort them, regardless of whether or not they spoke the same language or were a member of the same religious or ethnic group. So it was really, really optimistic. And I wrote, a series of Instagram posts about how incredible this experience was and how, yes, it's true that we can't count on our leadership and on the terrorist groups in the region And certainly we can't count on the international players who are invested in wars continuing forever. But if we educate our kids that they're each other's neighbors and each other's potential best friends and not each other's enemies, we can really make some progress here. We can change some on the ground realities if we just invest in our kids. And then I went back home after the event, and I woke up on October 7th at 8 in the morning to a siren, and my world as I knew it changed forever in ways that I'm still beginning to process. So now I'm back in the States for the time being, and I really have like a lot of just absolute rage, not only at the situation in Israel, but also with the gender ideology that hijacked half of my life. And I'm really channeling my anger from both of those things into this activism that I'm doing in the gender space, because I see a ton of parallels, and it's, frankly, it's also kind of cathartic. It's, I have a lot of insight into what, half a lifetime of being imbued with these really inaccurate and horrible ideas, like what that does to the psychological development of a young person, even without medicalization. So that's sort of why I'm here.
Okay, wow. So that's a lot. So let me just start by asking you about Israel and what's the rage there? Where is it directed for you there? What's the rage at specifically in this situation?
Well, obviously, I'm really angry at the terrorists. I on October 7th, I saw my friend, like, it was live streamed, being executed by terrorists. Like, while I was running in between bomb shelters to get away from the rockets. When I was back in the zone where there's Wi-Fi, which would not be in a bomb shelter because those are underground. I just went on social media to try to figure out what the hell is going on, because in the place that I was living in, we're not used to getting rockets even during times of war. We might get like one or two symbolic rockets, but on October 7th, I mean, just on that day alone, there might have been like 20 sirens and
And
multiple
where were you
explosions.
living?
I was living in Jerusalem.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, I did not take kindly to terrorists executing my friend. And seeing that live streamed, it was just the worst, most like helpless feeling. And I came back to the United States, and I had all kinds of negative feelings. I mean, there were a few weeks there where I just couldn't even get out of bed, really. Couldn't be bothered to, because I just thought, like, that could have been me. That should have been me. Like, my friend is just as good of a person as I am. And like, why did this happen to him and it didn't happen to me? Like, I just felt like there was really no point in living. And I've never been that depressed in my life before. I mean, my homeostasis tends to be quite happy and energetic and hopeful, but witnessing the things that I've witnessed over this war specifically, and I'd lived through 2 other wars in Israel, but this one really took a toll. And so I'm angry at the terrorists. I'm angry at Western universities and those institutions which prop them up and which give them legitimacy. And I'm really, I mean, yeah, there are really just a lot of things. I think the misunderstandings and the discourse around this crisis in the Middle East, I mean, there's so much misinformation. And so, yeah, I guess there are a lot of things to be angry about in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Have you been able to have some kind of trauma therapy or anything around that, what you experienced and what you saw and the loss of your friend?
So I do have a therapist, and
Mm-hmm.
and she's really amazing. So I am working through it in that regard. I also have friends who I talk to about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm so sorry. For you, that that is such a huge side to you, of course, and then you also have this other side to you, this that is the gender exploration. So I do want to ask you about that as well. And you talked about believing in this ideology. So tell us a little bit about, just working backwards. You're 24. What made you stop deciding to call yourself a man?
So, would you like me to just kind of start from the age of 12 when I got into this? Like how I got
So
into
maybe
it?
you could, sure. Okay, yeah, let's do that. That may be the best way to tell the story. So,
Hmm.
age of 12, super young. Had you started puberty yet?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I hit
Okay.
puberty actually pretty early. And I've got to say
Okay.
that when I hit puberty, I didn't, let's just say, I didn't have a fully developed sense of like sex constancy. Like
Mhm.
I had some developmental delays. I was actually born really early. I think I was born at like 31 or 32 weeks and I weighed a kilogram when I was born. So I had a bunch of odd developmental problems along the way. Like I never crawled.
Hmm.
Um, and so when I fell down, I didn't have the skills to pick myself back up. So that was my first stint in some kind of physical therapy. I wasn't even one yet. Um, I was a toe walker, and in order to correct that, I got Botox in my legs and I wore leg braces for some period of time. I learned how to tie my shoes when I was like 14, and I had to learn how to like swallow liquids properly also when I was 14. But yet I was reading like parenting books and medical journals at the age of like 8 and 9. So there was some pretty clearly like uneven development there. So sex, it makes sense that, the concept of sex constancy, I, just like any of my other quirks, didn't fully develop it by the time I entered puberty, like around my 10th birthday. And I was pretty shocked because some part of me thought that everybody was kind of screwing with me when they said that I was a girl. And then the changes started happening. And at first I was in denial until the changes became, more noticeable. And then I had kind of an oh shit moment where I was like, oh wow, like these people are not screwing with me. Like I actually am a girl. Um, so that was kind of odd. But yeah, so around the age of 12, a lot of things were happening. Um, it really started with the fact that I got an iPad for my 12th birthday. And from a very young age, I loved using the internet primarily for research purposes. I didn't really play video games, that didn't interest me. But my first internet research obsession was about the world's tallest people. I'd come across them in the Guinness Book of World Records, and I was fascinated by them. And so then I went on the internet and I realized that these people became super tall because they had a pituitary tumor, and this, which impacted their body's ability to secrete and regulate growth hormones. So it was just a constant flood of growth hormones. So these people became extremely tall and they experienced asymmetric growth. And this basically shortened their lives significantly. They often died very young. And at that age, I basically took it upon myself to try to solve this condition, to try to cure it. I wanted to figure out, is there a way to excise this tumor without harming the surrounding functions of the brain? Like I thought that at that age that it was my responsibility as like an 8 and 9 year old to figure out how to solve this condition. I was really obsessed with it. And to me, very few other things mattered aside from this condition, acromegaly and cats. Those were my obsessions. Um, so from that obsession, I developed a lot of research skills. And when I was 12, a lot was happening. And I guess I'll just take you through that time. I think I can attribute the whole start of this journey to one day in Arabic class when I was 12. We were engaging in the American cultural ritual of taking a stack of worksheets and passing it down. Take one, pass it down. And as the worksheets were making their way towards me, and as I was accepting the stack of worksheets, my hand briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates. And suddenly I experienced a bunch of odd sensations in my body. My heart rate decided to just skyrocket. I became kind of dizzy. My mouth became dry, but at the same time, I also felt this heat within my body that was so intense that it overcame the classroom air conditioning unit. And I was pretty discombobulated. And as I had opened my mouth to tell this girl to apologize to her for the brief touch of our hands, I tried to open my mouth and say sorry, but no words came out. So I did not know what was going on there. It was a bunch of just overwhelming sensations. And at first I thought that maybe I had contracted a disease from the stack of worksheets themselves, because they were also being handled by a bunch of, pre-adolescent boys who never showered. So at first I thought that I had contracted some illness from the worksheets. But of course I went onto WebMD later that day when I came home to search up my symptoms and figure out what was going on with me. And if there's anything about typing any miscellaneous symptoms into WebMD, whether they're symptoms of an actual pathology or just normal body aches and pains, it's that WebMD will tell you that you're dying. So I was convinced that, because my symptoms matched, potentially 3 different neurodegenerative disorders, that I had contracted something that was going to kill me very shortly. So I was pretty distressed about that, certainly. And like now I look back at that period and I realized that what I was experiencing was a crush, but I didn't know what a crush was. I thought that crush was that brand of orange soda, and I just thought that my peers were obsessed with the orange soda in the same way as they were obsessed with like silly bands or kendamas or penny boards or Pokemon cards. I thought that it was just another peer group trend that was going to at some point wane, but actually it just became stronger and stronger with time. My peer group kept talking about crushes. And at that time, I had sort of realized that it was hanging around girls that made me feel all of these intense feelings. And, I felt like such a total mess around them that I just didn't want to hang around girls, because I like to keep my cognitive wherewithal about me. I like to be able to form coherent sentences. So I started hanging out with a group of boys, and we all sort of created a strategic alliance in which we joined forces to incessantly and obnoxiously prank the teachers. And we did this because it got the attention of the girls. And none of us came to that conclusion or said it explicitly that that's what we were going for, but that's objectively what all of us were doing. And around that time, I started to develop, a desire to dress myself, because previously I'd gone to a school where everybody wears uniforms. But around the age of 12, I decided that, I want to develop my own style. And because my peer group were boys, I really wanted to wear what my male classmates were wearing. I wanted the snazzy haircuts that they were, having. And I also had developed a bit of an obsession with the Ellen DeGeneres show, because my piano teacher had showed us some clips of kids on the Ellen show playing songs as a way to sort of motivate us to practice and do our homework so that maybe we could too one day achieve fame. And I really didn't care about the piano, but what I did care about was Ellen DeGeneres. I thought that she was very snazzy, and I liked the suits she was wearing, and I wanted to wear the same thing. And I pretty quickly, came to the conclusion, based on what adults in my life were telling me, that this is unacceptable behavior, that it's even disgusting to look at a woman who is dressed in a very masculine way. And so I was told that by adults in my life, and there was a bit of dissonance there because I grew up in a very progressive West Coast city. So I had seen gender nonconforming people, including men, people who are very clearly male, but who are wearing female articles of clothing, typically, such as skirts and dresses. And this was explained to me under the concept of a sex change, that there are some, men who have quote unquote female souls, and that they undergo a sex change to become women. And one day the question rather occurred to me, which was like, so it's possible for men to do these sex changes, but is it possible for a girl to become a boy? And just like the good little researcher that I was, I went on the internet in the same way as I looked up my symptoms of a crush on WebMD, and I searched the question, can a girl become a boy? And that's how, at the age of 12, in the year 2012, I got into trans, years before my peer group would latch onto the concept. So I really saw the trans movement evolve from 2012 onwards. So that's sort of how I got into it.
Wow. Okay. So In 2012, and I'm just trying to situate that historically in terms of the trans movement, this was, like you said, or on the early side for in terms of the ROGD boom, we could call it. And it was in 2015 that the that Time magazine had Laverne Cox on the cover that said the trans tipping point, and representing kind of the cultural tipping point. Bruce Jenner came later as well. So yeah, this was 12 years ago from right now. And so was there any for you accompanying, were there other feelings going on besides being attracted to women? So you described you're attracted to girls and you liked a more masculine style and you liked Ellen. And what about your body? What were your feelings around your developing body? Did you have negative, positive, neutral feelings around that? What was going on in that realm for you?
Mm. I think I was sort of in denial of the fact that my body was developing. It was pretty uncomfortable because, as I spoke about earlier, I hadn't fully developed a sense of sex constancy. Like when I was a kid, and I have a brother, and as little kids we would run around naked, and so obviously I knew what the difference was between boys and girls, but I just thought that I just thought that something happened to my penis. I just thought that it fell off or that it would grow, or like, things that kids think, right? It's the lack
Yeah.
of a full understanding of sex
Mm-hmm.
constancy. And because of these developmental delays, I was really quite shocked when it turned out to be true that I actually indeed was female, and that's something unmutable. When I hit puberty, at first, I mean, even though the changes were explained to me, and I would basically keep saying them out loud around my parents, hoping that they would sort of say, "Oh no, we were just screwing with you. That's just a joke."
Oh,
But I would keep
yeah.
saying it out loud, like waiting for somebody to say, "Oh no, we were just joking with you," but it
Oh,
wasn't actually a joke. And I was just waiting and waiting in suspense, like, when when is everybody going to get on the same page
oh,
about this?
wow.
So I was really quite confused. And
Mm-hmm.
I say that when I started to develop breasts, um, I was still in such denial that I just thought that, oh, maybe I'm just getting a little bit pudgy. So I started to do a lot of like sit ups and push ups, and I wanted to become really buff. And really, at the beginning of puberty, I thought that if I just worked out a ton, that I would somehow be able to like not experience those changes. And I definitely had a phase where I would, like at the very beginning of puberty, where I would like take my shirt off and do a bunch of exercises and walk around different girls who are a few years older than me and flex my muscles and ask them to ask me like where the beach is, so that I could like flex
Oh,
my muscles and say like that way.
oh my gosh.
So
Okay.
I definitely had a phase like that. Um,
Yeah.
but when the changes became something that I couldn't ignore anymore, I was totally distressed by them. I felt totally discombobulated. Like I was very, very disconnected from my body because I existed almost entirely in my mind. And really, I mean, I would show up to school every day as a kid. I'd go through the ritual of putting my uniform on, you know, taking my lunch to school, sitting in the classroom, and I really had no clue what was going on around me. Like I would look left, I would look right, I would try to see like what's going on the other kid's worksheet. I would look up, I would see fluorescent lights that would flicker, it would give me a headache. So it was all kind of overwhelming, and I wasn't tracking anything that was going on. And so I would just pretty quickly retreat to the world of my own thoughts and think about like whatever rare brain tumor I was interested in that week, or whatever the topic of my interest was, because I just wasn't picking up on what was going on around me. And it wasn't really until the age of 14, when I was diagnosed with and medicated for ADHD, that I had realized that there was this whole world that I was missing out on, which was the world that everybody else lived in. So I was really quite disconnected from my body, really throughout my entire life. And I think that that also played a pretty massive role in in the trans identification.
Yeah. Okay. So you're super self-aware. You've always been super smart. And that is something that we see many a time with kids who identify as trans. They are super smart, and I love the way you put it. You said you were kind of living up in your head all the time, and that's a theme that I see so many times throughout these different stories, these different detransition stories that I hear. So so you're going through all this stuff, and then did you ever medicalize, by the way?
No, I managed to not medicalize. Um, so my parents were not affirming. I mean, and they were ahead of the curve in that regard, because in 2012, nobody had really heard of the idea of a transgender child, minus, the people who were transitioning their kids, or somebody who had seen Jazz Jennings on the Barbara Walters special. So my parents were automatically skeptical of the idea, especially, because one of my parents comes from um, like a former Soviet background. And people who are from the former Soviet Union, what I've noticed, especially Jews, and my family is Jewish, that they're naturally skeptical of institutions simply because of the fact that they are institutions. And so my parents did not affirm, not just the trans identity, but even just the gender nonconforming style. I mean, it was a massive battle just to get a haircut, and to wear, the clothes I wanted to wear. And I never really did get to do that as a kid. I always had to compromise for the most androgynous thing in the women's section. So it felt like my life was just a series of compromises. And I knew that, once I started to put two and two together and realize that these symptoms were really just signs of a crush, I knew that also would be quite a bit of a problem. So, but that happened sort of years down the line. So my parents didn't affirm. And once they realized in college that this trans thing was not going away, they basically put some stipulations in place. And they said, if you want us to continue helping you through college financially, you're not going to medicalize, and you're going to study abroad for a year in a country that doesn't support all of this stuff. And I had previously been to Israel on like an 11-day trip to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I really fell in love with the country because I had been studying Arabic since I was 12. I grew up speaking English and Russian. And I'm Jewish, although I didn't grow up being very connected to my Jewish roots because of that Soviet background. And because under communism, religion was illegal. So, a lot of the cultural traditions that were in some way correlated with religion, those got largely lost. So in college, I had basically started to explore my Jewish roots. But because I had studied Arabic since the age of 12, and because I was surrounded in this sort of leftist echo chamber, I naturally became one of those pro-Palestinian campus activists. And there was a Jewish organization on campus that actually saw that there were a few Jews on the pro-Palestinian side, and they called us in. And the director of this organization had told me, look, like, I can tell that you're very intellectually interested in this conflict, but I have a feeling that you're not getting the whole story. And we're going to take a trip to Israel and learn about this conflict in an institute. You're welcome to apply, and if you get in, we'll pay for everything. You just show up. So I did that. I got accepted. Both the girl I was dating at the time and myself, we were both accepted into this program, and we went to Israel. And after the institute itself was over, my girlfriend and I at the time had decided to extend our plane tickets. And we booked a few sort of different tours around the West Bank. And these were not formal tours. We just did this ourselves. One day we stayed in a refugee camp in Bethlehem. And the next day we stayed in this city called Nablus with a Palestinian multimillionaire in his mansion, which he had rented out a room of for an Airbnb. So about as different backgrounds within that society as you can possibly get. And on our way from Bethlehem to Nablus, my girlfriend and I had gotten onto a shared taxi, and we got off at the wrong stop. And Google Maps at that time in 2018 in the West Bank really was not up and functioning. So it was very old school. Like, you had to go around and ask people directions about how to find your way from one place to another. So my girlfriend and I, with our massive suitcases, were walking around a different city, hoping that somebody could give us some directions. And we stumbled into a coffee shop. And the owner of the coffee shop immediately sees us with our suitcases and he welcomes us in. And my girlfriend and I sit down and we realize that in this cafe, everybody's a man. And that's because in most Arab cities, Arab culture is very homosocial, meaning sex segregated. So a lot of cafes as well are sex segregated. And of course, they don't say no women allowed, but it's an unspoken rule. Like there are places that women congregate and places that men congregate. But of course, tourists have much more flexibility to break those rules because it is assumed that they don't know the social rules. So we were sitting with this owner of the cafe. He gave us free hot dogs and free coffee. He welcomed us in. He was talking to us. His English was really quite decent. He had family in the States, and we had a really interesting conversation. And somewhere along the line in the conversation, I told him that I actually speak some Arabic. So we switched to Arabic, and he asked me a question and referred to me in the masculine. And that's the moment in which I realized that while in the United States, the way that I go about life and the way that I present myself with the clothing and the haircuts would get me perceived to be a masculine woman, in this part of the world, the same exact presentation gets me perceived to be a guy. And that's the moment in which I realized that actually it was my girlfriend who was the exception to the no women in the cafe unspoken rule. So I really had an aha moment. And later I had actually gone into Jerusalem with this girl that I was dating, and with another friend that we'd met along the way. And so she and this other friend, they went to the women's section of the Western Wall. We ended up in Jerusalem. We went to pray at the Western Wall. So they had gone to the women's side of the Western Wall, and I had a yarmulke in my pocket. I put it on my head, and I waltzed right into the men's section because I had sort of realized that, in this part of the world, I can do what I've always wanted to do and live as a man. So I went into the men's section, and this 18-year-old kid from New York greets me, and he asks, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yes, I'm Jewish." And then he asks me, "So are you above the age of 13? And I thought, ouch, because I was 19, but I told him that I was. And he asks me if I've wrapped tefillin that day. And tefillin, it's this Jewish ritual that men who are 13 years and older are obligated in, which is basically the wrapping of these black sort of leather straps that include there are boxes on them, and they include Torah scrolls inside, and you're basically supposed to wrap these straps and say a prayer. So he asked me if I had engaged in this ritual, that day, and I told him that actually I'd never done it before. And this kid gets so excited.
And it's a ritual that's only for men?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Only men are obligated in it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so he gets so excited, because there's this Jew that has never done this really important ritual, and he's going to be the one to take me through it. So he gets super excited. He shows me how to do the ritual. And he says, "So you've never done this, not even at your bar mitzvah?" And I told him, "Well, no, I've actually never had a bar mitzvah." Next thing I know, he yells to a few of his friends in Yiddish. And a few seconds later, I'm holding hands with like 7 ultra-Orthodox Jewish guys. And we're singing songs, dancing. And then we hear a siren. It's a Shabbat siren, letting everybody know that the Sabbath is about to start. So they can start, making their preparations to head home. And because cell phone use is prohibited on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, this guy, is he asks me with certain sense of urgency. He's like, "Hey, give me your phone." I thought he needed to make a phone call. He asked me to help him open the camera app. And I had to teach him, he wanted to take a picture, and I had to teach him to press on, that white circle in order to take a picture, because this kid had clearly never used a smartphone before. And he tells me to stand in front of the Western Wall. And I asked him, "Well, where would you like me to stand?" And he said, "Well, where would you like me to take your bar mitzvah photo?" And I look at him and I say, "Excuse me, sir?" And he says, "Yeah, Mazal Tov, you're a bar mitzvah now. You can send this picture to your friends and family after Shabbat, and they'll give you money." And I just thought to myself, there's no way I'm going to do that. But I was diplomatic, and I told him, "Thank you." So that's the story of how I had a bar mitzvah that I didn't know happened until it was over. And that really cemented both my Jewish identity and my male identity. So when I had to pick a location to study abroad in, of course I picked Israel, because the other option would have been Russia, and there's no way I would have been able to do any of this in Russia. Because I wasn't allowed to pick a Western country, of course, because the West is going along with all this stuff. So I picked Israel because I realized that, while my parents were doing this so that I wouldn't live as a man and so that I wouldn't transition, I basically decided to play them. And precisely because I chose a society that's so traditional and where the sort of the sex norms are so prescriptive, I realized that I can actually live out this dream that I had had since I was 12. So that's really a story of how I embarked upon, the journey of basically living undercover as a man in Israel, both within religious Palestinian Muslim communities and within Orthodox Jewish communities. So that's sort of how that started. And the reason I brought that up is because you asked about, did I medicalize? So the goal was always medicalization, but there were a few roadblocks along the way. The first of which is that once my study abroad ended, I decided that I wanted to stay in Israel and become an Israeli citizen. And I was told by the agencies who handle these types of cases that it would be like maximum 9 months. And there were a few problems along the way because my Jewish roots are in the former Soviet Union, but I'm an American citizen. So the bureaucracy didn't know how to handle my case. I was basically bounced around 5 different agencies who kept saying, you're not my problem, you're these people's problem. So they just, for 3 years, kept bouncing me around between different agencies. And in those 3 years, I was illegal. I had no status. Like, they weren't going to deport me because I was a Jew in the process of Aliyah, which is, that's the Hebrew word for the process of becoming an Israeli citizen as a Jew. So they weren't going to deport me, but I didn't have any status. So I didn't have any access to healthcare, and I didn't have any access to a worker's visa. So I had to work a bunch of cash jobs, and I worked mostly within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish sector of the society as a house cleaner and a caterer. And so I did that. Like, I basically cosplayed as an Orthodox Jewish guy. Like, I wore the whole getup, the yarmulke, the ritual fringes. I wore the white shirt, black pants. Like, I was fully in the role. And nobody really suspected anything. Like, it was really easy for me to fly under the radar, but it was really like living and working like undercover. I was living my dream. It was complicated, but my entire adult life I had lived as a guy. So I didn't really know anything different. Like, it's only recently that I've started living my adult life, not trying to convince everybody that I'm actually a man. But the process of desistance for me, there were many seeds of doubt along the way. Absolutely. But most of them I was able to sort of shove into the back of my mind and ignore them. The first seed of doubt, I would say, was planted when I was 19. And I was reading the book Stone Butch Blues with this girl I was dating at the time. And the main character is a butch lesbian who transitions. And, the way she described her attraction to women and her relationship with her body and society, it was an experience that really rung true to me. And it was the first time that I'd heard this very type of niche experience, not described under a trans label, but really as a subset of a lesbian experience. So this woman, this main character, when she transitioned, had lost touch with the lesbian community because people had stopped perceiving her as a woman. And upon reading this story, I really had my first oh shit moment, which was like, oh shit, I've never given myself a chance to just live as a lesbian. But by 2018, already there were no lesbian communities among my age group. They simply didn't exist. So I was able to, shove that seed of doubt into the back of my mind and not encounter it because there simply was no reason to. So I went back to being trans. And when I was 20, that's really when I moved to Israel. And I'd say that the first sort of seed of doubt that I really did follow up on started really at the age of 21. I would really trace my process of desistance really back to May of 2021 when I found myself living through my first war in Israel. So I often say that my process of desistance started in a bomb shelter. Really what happened is that I was dating a different girl at the time, and we were going to go see like a drag queen show in Tel Aviv. And we kept delaying our departure, because different things came up. And eventually I realized that, okay, there's no way we're going to make this show on time. We're not going to make it on time. And out of the blue, I heard a siren. And I look at my girlfriend and I'm like, what the hell is this? She's like, they're launching rockets at us. I'm like, what do we do? She's like, well, we need to go to a bomb shelter. And I just look at her and I'm like, well, where's the bomb shelter? And she's like, I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood. So the first few sirens we hear, we run down to the lowest level because you're less likely to get hit by a rocket when you're on the lower level. And then we'd eventually found the bomb shelter, and there were 2 cats. We had to pack them up in carriers every single time and run to the bomb shelter. And there were a couple times we just didn't make it to the bomb shelter, and I had seen like 3 rockets go over my head, like one after the other, ripping through the air. And it's loud and it's terrifying. And so eventually, I was running in and out of bomb shelters, and you never know when the next siren is going to come. Like, part of the terror of it all is the unpredictability. Like, you don't ever feel like you can even go to the bathroom or take a shower, because there's nothing more awkward than having a head of soapy hair and then you hear a siren and you have to like run to a bomb shelter in a towel. So your whole life is on hold until a ceasefire is announced, basically. And in between running to the bomb shelter, I'd opened up my Instagram, because that is something that you can pause as soon as you hear a siren. And I started seeing my leftist American friends who I'd known from, high school debate, commenting and making all sorts of like horrendous posts, basically justifying that Israelis deserve to live under rocket fire. And because I used to be one of those pro-Palestinian campus activists until I realized that the left was lying to me and not telling me the whole story, I basically thought, well, all of these people are in the place that I was a few years ago when I didn't have the whole story. And they just don't have access to the information, that shows them that there's another side to this conflict. So I decided to be the one to basically present them with information showing them that, hey, like, even if you don't give a crap about the Jews, which I'm increasingly convinced that they don't, and that they're just straight up anti-Semites based on some of the posts that some of these people have made, I had come to the conclusion that I just need to provide them with information that sort of fills in the blanks for them. Like, I was operating under the assumption that they didn't have adequate information to come to a more comprehensive understanding of the situation. So I looked up some credible evidence and sort of stories and different accounts to show them that the group that they are supporting, Hamas, is a terrorist group, which, in addition to making Israelis' lives a living hell, also makes the lives of Palestinians in Gaza a living hell, using them for human shields and dragging them into endless wars and creating a vast, tunnel network to house their weapons instead of to use as bomb shelters to protect their civilians against wars. And I thought that if I'm able to provide them this information, they'll stop supporting the terrorists, not even because they care about Jews, because I already realized they weren't going to do that, but because they cared about Palestinians. I thought that they would accept this information, showing them that Hamas is a terrorist group that also harms Palestinians. But that's not what happened. Instead, they got really angry at me. They called me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer. And so at that moment, 2 things happened. The first of which is that I became extremely disillusioned with the Western left, because these people were all smart. Like, these are all people I knew from debate. And I'd realized that even the more like intellectual stream of the Western left, had become totally dogmatic and averse to entertaining other ideas that might question the worldview. So that was one major shift that happened. And the second one is really, as any parent who has a kid who's struggling with his gender stuff knows, internet algorithms are very powerful. And in the process of trying to, look up credible sources and data that my lefty Western friends could fact check, in the process of searching this, this alternative evidence for them, the algorithm had started suggesting me more content that was in line with, the basket of opinions, of acceptable opinions on the more right-wing side of the political spectrum to which the pro-Israel ideas belong. So I started to get more information about like the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests and things of that nature. And then eventually I had started to see stuff that was critiquing gender ideology. And it shocked me because I was never super involved within the trans community. I was sort of a lone wolf trans. Like I I did my own thing. Like even at university, there was a trans community and I had some contact with them, but I was really much more interested in hanging out with the Arabs because I really like Arabs. Um, and so it was kind of shocking for me to see how this whole community had just evolved, and like with the drag queen story hours and the neo pronouns and the non-binary and the colored hair and piercings, like so I had seen this whole thing evolve, but then it stopped because then I went to Israel, and on the internet I was exposed to the fact that gender ideology was just blowing up and subsuming Western institutions. And I had come across my first sort of set of stories of detransitioners. And because I was already used to my worldview being shattered in regards to like Israel-Palestine, I clicked on it. Like I wasn't scared to click on these stories and watch them. And the first detrans story I saw, I watched it, and it was a girl who was very feminine. And like the first stream of detransitioners, a lot of these girls were feminine and heterosexual. And I thought, well, of course they regretted it. Like they're feminine straight girls. Of course they would regret it. But I'm not like them. I'm not going to regret it. And it was really, but I'd gone down the route of seeing the stories of detransitioners pop up and them discussing the ways, in which they got into trans, which was the peer influence, which was also something that didn't happen to me because I got into it so early that there wasn't an element of peer influence. And I was basically for a while convinced that no, I'm the truest of the true transsexuals. Like if you look at those diagnostic criteria, I would have met them. I mean, I was insistent, consistent, persistent. I was really, a gender nonconforming homosexual. I mean, that's the most quote unquote valid type of trans there is, according to the true trans camp, right? So, but it was only after I had started to meet detransitioners in real life, some of whom were butch lesbians, that I realized, like, wow, there are women who have a lot in common with me, and they transitioned, and they still regretted it. And that was the moment in which I really sort of had to reconceptualize this entire thing. But even after meeting detransitioners, that didn't stop me because I'd already created this super complex, interconnected network of social relationships in which very few people around me knew that I was female, and some of my Palestinian friends didn't even know that I was Jewish. So I had this really interconnected web of social interactions that I just didn't know how to undo. And so that became automatically very complicated for me. But it was really like, a big moment in which I really gave up the trans illusion or the trans fantasy fully. It was really around October 7th, actually, waking up to a siren. I was so discombobulated. I didn't have time to, wake up and, force my body into a binder, because I had to make it to a bomb shelter. So I just, it was complicated also because in my mind, a few things are going on. Like everybody in this neighborhood knows me as a guy, so they can't see that I have breasts. And on the other hand, there's a siren and I need to get myself the hell out of here and into a bomb shelter. So I didn't have time to put on the binder. I just layered a bunch of shirts on and just decided to run for my life. And of course, I had to feel the way that my body naturally moves without constraints, without the compression of the binder, which is very, very uncomfortable physically. And, I never knew when the next siren was. And so I just didn't put the binder on because that thing can sometimes take quite a while to get on. And I needed to be fully present in order to make it to a bomb shelter in time. So it was really, honestly, this whole process of running in and out of the bomb shelters without any kind of compression around my body and realizing that, as uncomfortable as this is, my body being healthy and intact is a necessity here. And, in between the sirens and in between the runs to the bomb shelter, I really had to contemplate, like, what if I were in a hospital right now recovering from top surgery, the elective double mastectomy, and I couldn't raise my hands above my shoulders? Like, if I were in the hospital right now, what would come of me? Like, if any, you can't predict when these wars happen. You can't predict when you're going to hear your next siren. Sure, you can take time off of work to recover from a surgery, but you can't, take time off of transition, and predict when the next war is going to happen. It's impractical. And additionally, like what we're seeing with this war, with this current war between Hamas and Israel, is simply the fact that this war lasted way longer than anybody could predict, and there's no way that doesn't impact supply chains. And because I had done so much research into transition, really ever since I was 12, but then ever since starting to go down the gender critical rabbit hole, I learned that, women who are on testosterone for extended periods of time really risk massive damage to their female reproductive system. And that even if you don't initially want a hysterectomy, at some point you're probably going to have to get one. And if there's anything more dangerous to your body than flooding it with copious amounts of cross-sex hormones, it's really having absolutely no sex hormones in your body and being reliant upon synthetic hormones. If there's anything, more dangerous than having tons of cross-sex hormones in your body, it's having absolutely no hormones in your body. And so I had realized at that moment that, like, actually, I don't want to be dependent upon pharmaceutical industry for the rest of my life, because I never know when the next war is going to happen and whether or not I'll even be able to get these hormones. And so that is it was like living through war that made me realize like how impractical transition is. And yeah, really the process of desistance has been trying to come to a conclusion about really who am I? Like, under all of the lies and under all of the obfuscations, like, who am I as an adult? Like, what does any of this mean? Who am I outside of trying to convince everybody that I'm a man? And what does my future look like outside of transitioning into becoming like a pseudo heterosexual, pseudo male? Like, now I have to really contemplate and contend with all the distress that I had been locking away in a time capsule from the age of 12 until the age of 24, and opening up, each of those time capsules and dealing with all of this distress that I should have been working through as it came up. But instead I just locked it away because I was so hell-bent on transitioning and living this life, as a man. So that is my very long sort of rant about, the whole trajectory of my life up until this point.
Yeah, fascinating. So when you wore the binder, just to kind of zoom in on that for a sec, did that cause pain or any kind of discomfort or issues? Did you ever have any issues with the binder? How long did you wear one for?
So I was binding daily, definitely more than the recommended 8 hours a day, for 7 years. There were even some times that I slept in the thing because, because I would do these peace events in Bedouin villages, and I was, I had an image to maintain, so I couldn't just take it off. As far as the discomfort, I mean, the thing with binding is that at first it actually felt very comforting because of the compression. The compression itself, it felt like a hug. But I liken binding very often as in like it's a sweet poison. Like, it's kind of like you've heard of stories of like women poisoning their husbands with antifreeze. And before the early 2000s, antifreeze had a very sweet taste to it. So a lot of people who were being poisoned by it, they didn't realize that it was poisoning them until it was too late, because the taste was so sweet that you can mask it, within some other type of sweet drink. And you don't realize that you're actually drinking poison until it's far too late. And I think that binding is very analogous to that, because obviously I had distress around my breasts. I had come to the conclusion at the age of 12, especially when it was solidified by the trans framework, that really, because of these feelings I'm having, that my natural, healthy female body existing in its natural state is existing in a state of pathology that I'll be able to remedy with dangerous and experimental medical treatments from the moment that I become financially independent of my parents, and that I just need to undergo these transition interventions. So because that was the way that I had framed my experience, binding was simply a way, it was like a stopgap measure until I can have my breasts removed. And so in the start, binding felt very comforting emotionally, but also physically because of the compression. But binding is an intervention which with time accrues more and more harm. Like ever since I stopped binding, I really realized it because, the binding becomes more and more uncomfortable. The more time you spend in this compression garment, the more like the elasticity of the skin in your chest is impacted, lost rather. And my posture changed over time. Even my breathing patterns changed over time because you can't take a deep breath in a binder. And I noticed myself often like holding my breath, even though I'm not binding anymore. I just noticed that sometimes I'll hold my breath. Like my breathing patterns have totally changed. And it's not something that you realize immediately. It's this type of damage that you sort of accrue over time. Like the longer that you bind, that's really where the damage, it happens increasingly over time. And I didn't realize the full extent of the damage of binding really until I stopped binding, and started wearing sports bras, because then I really started to realize like, whoa, I don't think this is the way that my body is, supposed to naturally be functioning. Like I did something to myself here that is irreversible. I mean, even, people talk about, I think there's this false dichotomy between desisters and detransitioners. And obviously, detransitioners who have stopped, a medical transition from the intervention, like surgical and hormonal interventions, versus desisters, they're obviously two groups that have very different medical needs. But the idea that detransitioners have, medical harm in addition to psychological harm as a result of this process of transition, and that desisters are simply contending with psychological harm, that's false. Because if you are really truly like socially transitioned in the way that I was, where I was full-time living as a guy and I couldn't afford to have somebody figure out the fact that I was female, I mean, I was full-time binding, including sleeping in the thing. And so I would say that interventions like binding and tucking, especially when you do them regularly, do cause you physical harm. And that's why, I've seen a lot of people, including some like gender critical trans identified people, saying like, oh, just like social transition is fine, just let the kids like experiment, with clothing and behavior and stuff. And I would say that you absolutely should let kids experiment with like clothing and hairstyles, but that's different from affirming a cross-sex identity with like name and hormones and even binding and tucking and things of that nature. I mean, if you tell a child, or hell, even a young adult who doesn't know themselves, if you refer to them under a cross-sex identity and that becomes intertwined with their developing sense of self, that is very different from just allowing somebody to experiment with clothing and hair. Like clothing and hair, that's fine, and that's actually what adolescents do. Like adolescents since the dawn of time have been experimenting with unconventional choices in hair and clothes. But what's new here, and what is actually a very powerful psychosocial intervention, is saying that, in order to justify this gender nonconforming presentation, that, we're going to refer to you as, a false identity with the pronouns in the name. These are two very, very different things. And so for me, this all became incredibly intertwined, and it actually made it a necessity for me to bind. And really the social transition in and of itself brought me closer and closer and closer towards medicalizing, simply because of the fact that, I was illegal, and I was really pushing on this citizenship process so that I could become an Israeli citizen and access these medical treatments. But I knew that at some point, like, people would stop taking me seriously as a guy in his 20s, because people are willing to suspend their disbelief only up to a certain point. And at that point, like, the older I got, the harder it would be to convince people that I actually am a guy of my age. They would start to ask more questions about why I look so young, because Middle Easterners, they're not polite like Americans are. They say what's actually on their mind. Like, if they don't like you, they will tell you to your face that they don't like you. And, I'd had instances of like groups of teenage boys asking me like, are you a boy or a girl? So I knew that those questions would only get more intense from more people if I didn't medicalize. And really from the moment that I became an Israeli citizen, I already started the bureaucratic process. Like I signed up, with a gender clinic, and I had started that process immediately. because that's what I was really looking forward to. So I would say that social transition is not a neutral act. It actually pushes people closer and closer down the path of transition, because in order to maintain that false identity, especially when all of your social interactions and your social relationships are built upon a false premise, you do have to follow through with that, because it's so hard to think about at that point. Like, you've invested so much into transition that it's damn near impossible to envision your life without that goal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you talk about how the social transition can influence a medical transition. It makes so much sense the way you outline exactly how that can happen and why it would put more pressure on you to take it further and further so that you can continue to maintain kind of the illusion that you've created for other people and for yourself. Um, was there stress for you to have to deceive people on a daily basis, or was it pretty easy? What was it like for you? When you laid your head down at night, was it like whew, or was it like, oh my God, like I can't believe this? Was it, yeah, what was that? Was there a stress there? Was there pressure there on you mentally?
So I would say that the way I lived my life, I didn't see it as deception, because I
Okay.
fully bought into the idea that I have, this male. I wouldn't say I believed in the male soul idea, because I don't believe in the soul. Like, I never have. But I certainly believe that I have a male brain in a female body, and that my body is pathological. And
Okay.
so I fully bought into it. I mean, I didn't think that I was literally a man. Like, I knew
Mm-hmm.
that I wasn't male, but I had gotten this idea into my head when I was 12. So I lived my entire life in line with that. But like, with pursuing transition as being the goal. But there were definitely times, like, when, like, overall, like when I was in the West Bank and in Jerusalem and in other more religious areas of Israel and the West Bank, it didn't feel like deception. I mean, when I was living as a guy, I didn't really do stuff I didn't live life in a super different way than I do now. I mean, I I always enjoyed wearing men's clothes. I felt much more comfortable that way. I would get super cool, like, snazzy Arab haircuts, like in Arab barbershops. Um, I didn't have to change the way I talked or acted. I just behaved in the way that was most authentic to me, and it was easier to live as a man, within those surroundings. Just being the type of very, like, masculine, being a masculine lesbian, especially in that part of the world, is much easier just to live as a guy, because people will assume that you're a guy. I mean, even later down the line, when I started introducing myself to people as Maia and speaking in Arabic and Hebrew, which are gendered languages, speaking about myself in the feminine, people I would meet would just assume that they misheard my name and assume that I was bad at Arabic and Hebrew and mixing up the pronouns. Like, people were, even when I was going out of my way to not deceive people, like, people just perceived me to be a guy. And that's part of why it was so easy. But there were definitely moments in which, especially more liberal people from, like, Tel Aviv, the more secular liberal types, they were familiar with butch lesbians, so they were able to tell that I was female, or at the very least, they were confused by my appearance. And there were a lot of times when I'd be hanging out at a bar with my Palestinian Muslim friends, who were, like, secretly drinking and just kind of hoping that nobody took a picture of them while they were at the bar, and hoping that their parents didn't see it. Like, we were all living double lives. Like, we were all there living double lives, and they didn't know that I was female, right? So they didn't know that I was also living a double life. But, like, so I did hang around people who are very unusual in that regard. But anyways, like, there'd be times that I'd be hanging out with, like, my Palestinian Muslim friends at a bar, and some random, like, Tel Avivi liberal guy comes up to us and starts speaking to us, um and these Tel Avivi liberals, they really use the playbook of, like, the Western liberal with all the virtue signaling. Some of them really do that. And so they would come up to me while I was with my Arab friends, ask me, like, what are your pronouns? And they'd say it in Hebrew, and I would just pretend that my Hebrew was, like, really bad and I couldn't understand them. And then the bastards would switch to English and ask me what my pronouns are. And then I would just look at them and be like, what's a pronoun? What are you talking? What do you mean? So I was always able to weasel my way out of situations like that and not to raise attention to myself when I was hanging out with my Arab friends. But like, I was always very nervous because at the university, everybody knew me as a woman, although a lot of people just thought I was a guy, because it was in Jerusalem, so it was a pretty conservative place. And whenever I'd go into the women's restroom, like all of the, young hijabi women would just like, they would breathe in because they were kind of, they thought that I'd gone into the wrong bathroom. So like everybody in the university, like they knew me as a woman eventually because that was what was written on my documents. But in my like everyday social life, everybody knew me as a guy. So when those two worlds would collide, I was definitely really quite nervous. Like I would try to plan my social interactions and the places I'd hang out with people on the basis of like, is it possible that anybody who knows me as a woman, could potentially show up at this bar and out me to my friends? Like there were a lot of mental calculations that had to be made. But like for me, living a double life was super normal because even when I was like dating girls in high school, I also had to live a double life because I grew up in a really progressive city where it was acceptable to be gay, but within my household, it was something that I absolutely had to hide. And so like I was also very paranoid about kids at school, taking pictures of me with a girl I was dating and posting them on the internet and tagging me and having my family see that. And like I was, like I definitely would sneak around with girls in high school. So I absolutely, like, from my adolescent years on, I was already living a double life and hiding a lot of things from different people. So this just seemed like this is just how you have to live your life. Like I saw that this type of double life thing as like, this is the way that a life is lived. I didn't see it as like, something majorly wrong or majorly stressful, but rather as like a kind of a coping mechanism, for circumstances that just are what they are.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. I definitely can see how that would develop as a coping mechanism for different external expectations or pressures that were put on you, standards that were put on you. So, Maia, thank you so much for sharing your story with me. It's so interesting to hear your insights about everything. I think you add so much to the conversation with how you help us understand your psychology throughout all of that, how you got into this, into your gender experience in the first place with wanting to be a boy, and then also your story about desisting and stopping that is so fascinating how it happened kind of through your really intense experience with the war, really unusual story there. And I'm going to link your Twitter below. Is there anything, and your YouTube channel as well? I know you have a YouTube. Is there anywhere else you want to shout out just for where people can find you after they watch this interview if they want to learn more about you?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm on Twitter at the Peace Poet 99 and on YouTube as at Maia Poet. I've also done a lot of other interviews, and so you can find me, like I've done interviews with with Buck Angel and Carol and Benjamin Boyce, Shapeshifter. Like there are a bunch of different interviews that I've done, and I've also written, like I've worked with an Israeli social worker named Tal Kroitoro on a series of children's books that aim to sort of be an antidote to like the I Am Jazz book, basically to inoculate young kids against gender ideology. And there's a series of books that we've written both for little kids. I mean, she wrote the ones for little kids, and those books are called like A Dog Stays a Dog and What Makes a Dog a Dog. There's a boys and girls version. Those are in multiple languages. I've also written a story based on my life with this social worker in Israel, called Leah's Journey. And that's really just about basically the type of stuff I've talked about in this interview. It's a graphic novel style. It's for teens and young adults. And all of the books are like an optional donation. And any donation that you feel inclined to provide goes to help Israeli detransitioners. And I'm really proud to have been involved in this project because Tal is the only social worker in all of Israel who's, the only professional in all of Israel who's speaking out against this madness with her name and face attached to it. And it's a really, important project that I'm very happy to be a part of, and I think it can help a lot of people. So that's where you can find me. And I I really just hope really that the message that I really there's a message that I really hope that the audience understands here. And I'm sure that as time goes on, I'll expand more on it. But I think that what fundamentally got me stuck into the trans idea is the fact that I was really lacking in like gay and lesbian role models. Like I didn't there was no accurate like lesbian representation within media. There was nothing I felt like I could relate to. There were no, I didn't see any like butch lesbians, having any kind of media representation. And when I was trying to envision a future for myself, I didn't have an accurate framework by which to understand what I was going through. Like, I didn't understand that what I was really experiencing was not the character arc of a trans kid, quote unquote, but really just the developmental process of a likely homosexual trajectory. And so I really think that, especially because we're filming this during Pride Month, that, kids who are growing up and coming to terms with the fact that they're gay or lesbian or bisexual, they're really lacking in adequate role models, adequate and age appropriate, or just appropriate in general role models who can show them a way to grow up and to just be gay and to be, happy and content with that. And in lieu of role models like that, the trans framework was extremely, extremely enticing to me because it did provide me a framework for how to grow up and become, for all intents and purposes, a straight man who doesn't get any kind of like negative social feedback for dating beautiful women and wearing super snazzy like vests and bow ties. Like, so the main message that I really want to take away is like, for the parents, if you think that your trans identified kid may be struggling with like a homosexual sexual orientation developing, I would say that the best thing that you can do for your kid is to not be as scared around like if they're experimenting with their style, whether they grow up to be straight or gay. Let your kids experiment with hair and clothing. Obviously, don't affirm the name, the pronouns, and the binding and tucking. That's negative, and that will entrench the trans identity. But like, let your kids, play around with their style. Don't make a big deal out of it because that could do them harm and like entrench the internalized homophobia. But additionally, like, find some gay and lesbian adult role models who see the harm that's being done to kids and don't agree with it. And if you have like some gay and lesbian adult friends who share your values, I would say include them in your kid's life. I'm not saying, put your kid in a gay bubble with older adults, but what I am saying is like, include gay adults in your kid's life, but also include people from a variety of different backgrounds who come from different countries, who speak different languages, maybe who have shared intellectual interests with your kids, because they really need to see a version of themselves that they can grow into. And that, in a way, can meet a lot of the needs that these kids who are likely to grow up to be gay may be trying to meet with a trans identity. And so I would just say, thanks for listening, and thank you, Sasha, for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that I did, Maya. Thank you so much. I think so much of that is incredibly valuable. I'm really excited to hear about the books. I'm going to have to look those up and I'll definitely link below. So that's fantastic. And I am so glad to hear about the work you're doing to support Israeli detransitioners. That's wonderful. That's so hopeful. So thank you for that positive message and so much valuable information and wisdom and advice that you've given. So thank you so much, Maya. We'll leave it at that for today, and hopefully we'll get a chance another time in the future to talk again.
Absolutely. Thank you.